Welcome to Unity. This video is pull up my notes, here we go. This video is a sort of condensed, sliced up version of my introduction lecture to the Unity editor. So you already know what Unity is, you already know what it does, you've maybe seen this other article on this website somewhere for the prerequisites, Cartesian coordinate systems, 3D spaces, stuff like that. And you have installed Unity and got it set up, and there's another article somewhere else. So let's start with creating our first project. To create a project, we do it through the Unity Hub, a separate piece of software that you have already installed. So to create a project, this would look blank for you. This will look empty. You won't have, a bunch of projects here. You just hit this new button. If you have different versions of Unity, you gotta do the drop down. And, you gotta remember what version you're in. You probably only have one version installed, so you can just hit new. And then you need to choose your template, and 3D is the default template, and that's the one we're gonna use. I think a lot of tutorials skip over the location of this one. Like, yeah, save it somewhere that makes sense for you, but don't. I've got notes on file management. Save it somewhere reasonable, but especially don't keep it in a OneDrive or Dropbox or syncing folder. Unity will create temporary files that it's constantly editing with in the background whenever you import something. And there can be conflicts really easy that'll mess stuff up. So we tend to not put things in those live sync folders. It'll also crush your computer. Your computer's gonna be constantly rescanning these folders unnecessarily. So I have it in there, but I go in and I turn off the syncing for specific library folders, the one you gotta disable that for. So a 3D project, give it a name, introduction, hit create. Mine already exists because I have already. Here it is. It'll take a little bit to load. And now we are in Unity. So I said this video was a sliced up version of the introduction to Unity, and that's because I'm sort of taking out the follow along parts, and I'm gonna put that in a separate video. So this video you can kind of full screen sit back and just watch. Hello. And then the other one will be slower and will guide you through everything. And you'll actually do the things. But still make the project, because you can after this one you can jump into that one. I'm taking the follow alongs from here and putting them over there. I'm taking the content from there, putting them here, and just you get it. Okay, moving on. So my desk is at the wrong height. I can't fix that right now. Moving on. I hit my knee and I got very distracted and I lost my train of thought. Welcome to the Unity editor. We have the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to give you an overview of the interface and the layout. And I know that's a weird place to start. You're like, oh, I want to make a cube and I want to make it move and blow up or something, make a game. No. We need to be able to navigate this window, and I need to be able to talk about it, which makes teaching in Unity much easier. I can tell you, hey, open this window, and you can just do that without having me to go, okay, click this, then click this, then click this. And it will be easier for you to learn and read and just work with if you can just get around. So we don't know how to do anything yet. Let's get around. Unity is a complicated piece of software. It's got a lot going on, a lot of features, a lot of tools, a lot of shenanigans. There may or may not be shenanigans. Every feature is contained in Unity inside of something called a window. So my scene is inside of a window called the scene window. And I can close that. My game view, whatever that is inside of a game window. My hierarchy, whatever this is inside of a hierarchy window. And we have these familiar projects, console, inspector. I don't know if you can. Yeah, you can't. You have to have at least one tab window open. So everything is inside of Windows. There's all sorts of windows. This is a lot like Adobe Photoshop or DaVinci Resolve or Blender or these other large, complicated 3D creative softwares you may have used. If you're doing Photoshop, you might be a digital painter, or you might be like me doing photo editing and compositing. You're gonna have different window layouts. You're gonna have different tools in front of you. And in Unity, you're gonna do that by opening and closing windows. So we can open our scene window back up. And you can open any window at any time. How they relate to the files I'll get to in a second. But any window can be open. You can always close it and reopen it, and you're not going to lose your work within scenes inside of Unity. Now, if you close Unity, you might lose some work, but you can move windows around freely. But let's say you're like me and you just completely borked your Unity scene and it looks like this. We use this very top right layout menu, and that's shortcuts to certain arrangements of windows. So you can always kind of get back to where you are. There's some that are really nice here. I like 4-split. Surprisingly, I like it for laptops, even though it like uses up more screen real estate, because on a laptop you probably don't have a proper mouse, so it's really difficult to like navigate 3D scenes. And when you have, instead of a 3D scene that you have to like spin around, you just have like, okay, I'll move it. You know, you can move it on 2 dimensions at a time. It's just like really easy to work in. It's great. You can move, I have a second monitor, my notes are up. You can move windows to second monitors, take your game window and put it to the side, very common. You can open the same window twice or 3 or 4 or 5 times. There's some presets that come with Unity. I don't have any, I have presets, but I not currently saved. I've been switching between different versions. Here's me working in a different project, and you can see I've moved things around. One thing I always like to do, I like my console visible when I'm doing code heavy work, and I like my scene and game views both visible when I'm doing constantly switching back and forth or doing UI stuff. There's no one perfect layout or arrangement of windows. My cat has knocked something over. We're just gonna keep moving. I'll worry about that later. There's no one constant arrangement of windows that's perfect. There's what happens more, unlike like a video editors all tend to have everything perfectly set up. Gosh, I like my heart rate just spiked. It's just like a little thing fell, but it scared me. Like video editors, you know, like me, my Photoshop layout, or when I'm working in Lightroom, everything is like in exactly where I expect it to be. Unity, that's not the case. You will be moving and manipulating and changing your windows and layouts all the time, because you switch different roles, you switch different objectives. You know, whether you're playtesting and you need the game view nice and big, or you're programming and you need that console and you're kind of switching back and forth, and or you're arranging your 3D scene. Now your scene's got to be the main thing, and your hierarchy's got to be a lot larger. Maybe you're doing lots of arrangement and you want your hierarchy and inspector to be next to each other for making drag and drop easier. You can do whatever you want, but you'll always be changing stuff, right? You know, you do an animation, you need windows that aren't even open right now, right? You need to get into things. So keep that in mind. Don't just stick with default. Always change things. So that's the windows. A brief tour of them, of the important ones, and the important ones are in the general submenu of the window menu, and they are the ones that are visible in the default layout. The hierarchy, which is a list, the scene view, which is a 3D space, the game view, which is your game as rendered by the camera, the project window, which is a file system, a file explorer, these folders and files, and your inspector, which is context sensitive. So as I click on different things, the inspector keeps changing to different things. So whatever I am selected, or is currently selected, will be in the inspector. So it's context sensitive. Gosh, I mean, that's the short version of a Unity layout. So let's make sure we're on the default view and we can see the scene. Great. Unity is not like other software. It's not like Photoshop, where everything is saved in a single .psd Photoshop document file. Unity doesn't save things in one file. A Unity project, an entire project, is a whole bunch of files. Some of the files we care about and that we will be editing. Some of the files are just Unity things behind the scenes. And I can show you what they look like in drag. There we go. In a file folder system. So here's an empty scene. I've not edited anything in this project. All I have is an assets folder, a library, logs, packages, project settings, a temporary folder, user settings, and a .sln file. Interestingly enough, we almost always only ever work in one of these folders, the assets folder. Assets is where we put all the stuff that make up our game. We'll get back to assets in a bit, but they go in this folder. The library is a auto-generated folder that has lots of weird little files that look like this that are super small. If you're copying a Unity project from one place to another, individual files add an overhead to copy. So even though they're not a large file size, kilobytes, it takes a long time to like copy the files. And that can be really annoying. And Unity often has to regenerate the library. This library is created from Unity. We can delete it. Look how many items there are, like 33,000 things. Well, it's in use, but we can delete the folder. We can delete everything in the folder, and Unity will be able to regenerate this stuff for us. So I'll just skip. Trying to delete this, whatever. And this is the folder that you should not have your OneDrive or Dropbox or Synology or whatever synchronized. Unity is now trying to is doing the regeneration. It's showing me this progress bar. It's recreating that folder. If you're like a Unity user, like I want to make stuff, and I'm telling you about this folder thing, like please stay with me. Stay with me. This is so important because these are where all of the mistakes. Skipping this basic understanding is where a lot of mistakes come from. So let's stay with it. So we deleted that library folder. We're now rebuilding it, recreating it from scratch, which is going to take a little while. So I will mention that when I back up my Unity projects, I tend to delete the library folder just to save file space on my backups and make them go faster. And when I copy them from one computer to another, I found that it's a faster for my fairly fast computers to regenerate that folder instead of transfer it. So something to keep in mind to help speed up your workflow. If you're using source control, if you're using like GitHub or something for a Unity project, you wouldn't synchronize. You'd ignore that library folder because each computer would just recreate their own versions. Of course, don't go deleting it all the time. You can break things. Don't do that. But you can. Okay. So everything in Unity is an asset. Everything in Unity is a actual separate file. So you can see I have a sample scene.unity and I have a sample scene.unity files here in my project. And a folder in Unity is just a folder on my hard drive right there. Let's take a look at a real project that I've already brought up a few times. This is a Solitaire card game that I've been working on. That shouldn't happen. It's Solitaire. You get it. I'm not going to play I am going to play Solitaire right now. Look at this. We're moving and grooving. Okay. This is the hardest game to work on because I've been procrastinating so much on doing anything because, it's Solitaire. I've just been playing Solitaire. That means it's a good game. If you're procrastinating on your development because you're like playing the game, that's a good thing. Okay. So let's take a look at our project window that shows us all the stuff in the game. I have a bunch of scenes, different types of Solitaire, Klondike, traditional Solitaire golf, some other stuff, a main menu. You can open that. And everything changed. All my items went away and everything, and I can go back and this is now completely different. This is completely different. So we'll get back to scenes in a second. We'll go over each one, but I'm just putting it in front of you first. Other assets that I'm using, sprites. I'm using, playing card images from Kenny. Just a bunch of individual images that I've got associated. I've got some prefabs, or we'll go as a future thing. Pretty much just the sprites and the scripts, the actual like game, the game scripts I've been writing in the code, which are just files. They're all just files. So that's all the stuff in the project. Okay. Unity projects are folders and files, and everything is inside of them. Your core base element of a Unity project is called a scene. And a scene is a scene file. We have seen that there is one scene in an empty project because you can't not have a scene. You can't not have a scene open in Unity. Unity needs a scene to be open. In fact, if we tried to I can't remove it. I can't discard it. I can't unload it because there's only one scene here. I can delete it. And then if I tried to I'm not going to relaunch it right now. If I opened it up and there was no scene for it to delete, I'll just hit save if we create it. If I opened it up, there's no scene. It would open an empty scene. It would open a scene that looked like this, and it would say Untitled, and then you'd hit save, and then it would. Oh, I don't want to save that. And then it would like it would still have something open. You'd hit save. It's just like, well, it's empty and it's nothing, but now it's something. So scenes are stored in these files. And a scene is two things. You can think of a scene as conceptually as two separate things. The first thing is sorry, I'm trying to open an example in the background. The first conceptually is as a list of game objects. I'm just trying to open up our scene file. The first is as a list of game objects. The hierarchy window shows us our scene as a list. Hey, what are game objects? I bet we're getting to that next. Stay with me. So it's just a list of things. The second way to think of a scene is as a three-dimensional space. And you know from the prerequisites that a three-dimensional space can be described with a Cartesian coordinate system. That's an x-axis, a y-axis, a z-axis. There are three number lines that are orthogonal to each other, and we can define any point in space as having coordinates in x, y, and z coordinates that define where that point is. So our scene is this 3D space. Our scene view shows us the view of the scene as a 3D space. Hierarchy shows us the scene as a list of objects. The scene view shows us the scene as a three-dimensional setting. Even 2D games like this one, even 2D games are still in three-dimensional spaces. We just ignore one of the dimensions. Neat. So I know the UI looks different between these two Unity projects. We'll get to it. We're going to get to it. So the scene is a three-dimensional space. Every item in the scene, all of these objects, has a position. We can see it in the top of the inspector. Every object has a position, and that is its position in space. So I opened up the actual the scene file, the text data of a scene here in this text editor, and I can now look through it, and I can tell you that this is a list of some of the settings of the scene, its render settings, occlusion settings, all that stuff. But eventually we get down to a list of game objects. If I search for game object : that should. There's the second one. There's actually there are references between them. Where's your name? So for that, we have a directional light, a main camera, and a cube. And those are the only game objects, and all the settings for the game object are stored in this file format called YAML, which you shouldn't ever edit it. Don't open up your scene file. Close that. Stop doing that. Unity is editor for the scenes. We can click on the things, and it's much easier to change those settings here than it is to change them in a text file. Don't do that. But it's important to note that there's no magic happening behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, every scene is simply a list of the game objects, all of the settings for the game objects, and it is conceptually a three-dimensional space. That's a scene. Game objects are, of course, the next thing to talk about. What are game objects? Game objects are everything and anything. They're in a conceptually quite void of meaning because they're just a thing. They represent a thing. What could that be? It could be anything, and that's the whole point of a game object. It could be anything. Our main camera is a game object. Our directional light is a game object. Our cube is a game object. You probably don't have a cube. These are the objects in our scene. What makes game objects different from each other are components, which are the thing we're going to talk about next. So our scenes are lists of game objects. So now knowing that when we edit a game object, we know, and we make a change to a game object, like I can move this light around, but that doesn't actually change anything. And I can move that light around, or I can change the color of the light or something. That is changing the scene file. It is actually being saved here. That's where the data, when I make that change, is. So I move this game object, and I hit save. I move this game object and hit save. Then my scene file is what has changed. When I undo that, I get a little asterisk right up at the top. It says, hey, you have unsaved changes. And I can hit save. That asterisk goes away, and the scene.unity scene file has been saved. But a Unity project can be made up of so many more than scenes. I mean, just consider this one. I have normal solitaire here, and I also have golf solitaire. In a game like a Mario, like a platformer game, you could have hundreds of scenes because every one of your levels is a new scene. How do you play golf solitaire again? Anyway. So game objects are the things that make up scenes. They are the actual content of your games. Your player is a game object. Your camera is a game object. The lights are game objects. Your terrain is a game object. Your question mark blocks, game objects. Your coins, game objects. Anything visual that we can render probably needs to be a game object. Almost certainly needs to be a game object. I mean, there's ways around it. Unity's very flexible. We can hack it apart. But traditionally, they're all game objects. Anything that moves in the world is going to be a game object. Anything that has a behavior is going to be a game object. But also things that don't have positions. I have this thing called a visual setter, which tells me what playing card images to use. And that this code doing that doesn't matter. It doesn't appear anywhere. It's location. I could change it all I want. You know, it's invisible. It has no representation in the scene as like a visual thing. But it still has a location in the scene because every game object has a location in the scene because every game object is in the scene. A scene is a list of game objects. Game objects are in the scenes. They must have locations. So game objects are things. Scenes are a list of game objects. What makes game objects different from each other are, item number 3, components. Components are the behaviors that we can give to a game object. So my main camera, when I select a game object, I can look through the inspector, and the inspector is going to show me all of my components. I have 3 components on this game object. I have a transform component, I have a camera component, and I have an audio listener, which has no settings I can change. The transform component is a component that every single game object has, period. End of story. You can't remove it. They all have transforms. Transforms control their positions in space. You need a transform. You can't not have one. You can't have 2 either. Your camera is a part of the rendering system in Unity, and it looks at all the visual stuff, things that have mesh renderers and sprite renderers and whatever, and it displays them. Cameras are fancy ways to convert from 3D spaces to 2D spaces, which is a entirely unhelpful yet very accurate definition of a camera. And it has all sorts of different settings we can change, like the background color, if we were using colors. The field of view. There's nothing in my scene, so that doesn't look like anything. Audio listener doesn't have any settings, but it still needs to be on a game object, because you need to listen to objects from a point in space. Audio sources are things that make sound, but you need to have relative positions between them so sound can come from the left or right or whatever. We're getting blah, 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 blah. Our directional light has 2 components as well. It must have a transform, so we know it has a transform. And it has a light component that has all sorts of settings we can change, like the color. And when I'm changing these things, I am changing the, I'm going to undo that. I don't know, it's like, doesn't look good. When I'm changing these things, I am I'm making changes in the actual scene file. So I still only have one asset, and I am changing the properties, keyword properties of the components, keyword components. All right, let's head to this actual project and take a look at some of this stuff. I have a manager script that does the core game logic of like determining when you win and lose. I have a little grabber, which is the actual either mouse or keyboard or controller, because I want this game to be have lots of input. And it has a bunch of scopes. It's got a mover. It's got a stack of cards that are represented as a component. It's got a input into the mover. It's got a way to visually display the stack. It's got active state machine. I wrote a state machine. It's got a rigid body for some reason. It's got a composite collider. Bunch of different components on this item. What else has, if we play the game, make some cards appear. Any of my cards, any of my cards have a card script attached to them. It tells them what they are. So components is where the real meat of the game happens. And when you are in Unity, 90% of what you're doing, if you're not doing the programming, is changing properties of game objects or creating game objects and moving them around. Well, moving them around would be changing their properties, creating them in order to have them to change. Yeah, change the background color of the camera. There's no green square there. Okay. So properties are the various bits of data in our components that we can edit. One of the properties of a back up. There are two types of properties. There's what we call a reference property and what we call a data property. In the editor, the difference doesn't really matter so much. You set the various settings to their appropriate values and you go. But in code, we start to care about this more. So let's dig into it. Data is data. That's it. That's it. My box collider has a bunch of checkboxes. Those are true or false booleans. I'm breaking things. Okay. The transform has vector 3s. It has X, Y, Z positions. Those are just some properties. That's all they are. And those are just numbers. Pretty much most properties are numbers. You know, colors are red, green, blue, and alpha numbers. These properties are just numbers. They're just data that gets saved right there in the scene file. We just save those values. We make changes. We save them. Done. The other type of property is a reference value. Every single game object and every single component and every single asset in Unity is given behind the scenes a unique identifier. So I can click on this. Let's use a sprite. If I look in my debug mode, I should be able to see my identifier, the various identifiers, some number behind the scenes that the Unity is using to keep track of all of your stuff. So this sprite renderer takes a sprite property, and that sprite property is a reference to some image. So behind the scenes, it's being saved as a number, that is the ID of the file that it is referencing. You don't need to know that pretty much ever, other than just being aware of how it works. But you don't need to like use those unless you're writing editor scripts. Don't hold me to that. That might not be. There might be reasons. I don't know. So if I wanted to change this icon, I can just drag and drop these assets, and these are actual .png files just sitting on my hard drive. I know you see the .meta and you're curious about the .meta, but like, simmer down. The .png files, the actual images, and I brought an image into Unity just by putting an image in the folder. And okay, I'm gonna change it back. I don't like this one. Undo. Okay, there we go. The hand. I lost my train of thought. And we can just drag and drop any images there. You know that this is a reference property because it has this little circle thing to the side of it. So sprites has this little rectangle where we can drop things into, and has a little circle next to it. Physics Material 2Ds has the same thing. What are some other? This is referencing a script of mine, an object of mine, prefab. But they got that little circle next to it, and that's how we know what they What's nice about that circle, you click on it, it'll bring up a view of your project, but it does show you every type of asset that could meet that. In this case, every sprite, every image in this entire project, which is like all the cards, but also like everything else from this asset that I imported. Somebody else made all that stuff. So if you have a nice naming convention, maybe everything that is related to my player starts with the letter P and then an underscore, and then, you know, here, my pop-up assets are, you know, as there's a naming convention. It's when you get to a project this big, you want to have everything named consistently and appropriately so that you can easily search for them by their file name. Trust me, it can be a mess to go find, you know, the specific cards. You know, I want my card. There they are. I can tell which one's which and just choose the right one because I'm naming things correctly. And correct in this case just means whatever is helpful. Okay, so we can see that our main camera has a render texture reference property, but pretty much everything else is just data. And our directional light has a flare reference property, but otherwise everything else is just data. It doesn't use any assets or game objects or components on the game objects that it could be referencing. So, okay, that's components. The very last thing are assets, and we've basically, just by the nature of talking about everything else, have talked about assets. In fact, I started with assets, but to clarify, because of these properties, we bring assets and drag and drop them into their various slots in the inspector, like dragging an image in. And Unity keeps track of everything via IDs. And that is what the .meta files are. The .meta files, I mean, we can look at them. They just tell us the actual ID of the file and all of our various import settings, which we're not going into. And they are associated with the file by that file name, by just being the same file name, but then with the word .meta. So it tells us what that file's ID is, and it tells us various import settings. You select a file, and you can change things. Often pixel art we need to make filter differently, and how Unity converts it behind the scenes, it's not the scope of this video. But that's what the .meta files do. If you delete them, you will probably break things. It'll recreate new ones, and it'll recreate a new random ID, and then anything that was referencing it might lose that reference. If you move files around, if you want to drag and drop and change the folders, doing that as a default, you should always you should move your files in the Unity project window, because it'll make sure it keeps track of all the meta files and moves them correctly. If you want to rename something, rename it from within the Unity editor, and that will, again, make sure that it renames the meta file and keeps the ID the same and keeps track of everything. So that causes just little things like that. Just knowing that there's that ID system behind the scenes will help prevent you from like making bugs happen. And it's the type of stuff that I just wish was in every other intro video, even though we haven't actually done anything yet. I know. How long are we into this recording? Half an hour? Yeah. Sit back, relax, take a sip of coffee, pause the video, get some coffee. Okay, you're back. Let's go. We actually don't have that much more to do. Let's move over to my whiteboard over. That's shadow. That's gross. But I just want to reiterate that there are scenes. The scenes are made up of game objects. Game objects are things. They do whatever and anything. What makes a game object actually important and relevant are its components, which are a fancy word for behaviors. When we write our own code, 95% of the time we are writing components. And components have properties and data associated with them. And one of the most important bits of data will end up being assets, like image files, sound files, and so on. But also our scripts. So components can even be assets. So assets are used by components. Components are used by game objects. Game objects are in scenes. And those are your 4 core pillars of understanding a Unity project. If you can understand those 4 things, you will be good to understand how all this stuff works. I have pages on this page in text, not video form, that go over all of this in more detail. So check those out and read those. We're going to end this video by actually making some things to set us up before the next video. So you've got Unity open. You clicked around. I want you to do, here's what I have all of my beginner students do when I'm teaching in person, which is the first thing I do is I tell them to like just start opening windows and moving things around and try to break Unity, try to crash it. And I encourage you to do this the same way. Just try to break Unity. See if you can, like I did at the beginning, and just, close something, how do we move windows around? I could explain that you need to drag it to like the middle part, but a bit away from the edge. On either side of a thing, and then it could either be a child or it could be free flow. Like, you just drag and drop, you'll figure it out. You're pretty smart. I believe in you. How do we close it? Well, just right click on the tab, not the empty space, but the tab. You'll be fine. It's fine. It's fine. Look at that. I can add a window right from there. I don't even need to go up here and move it, right? Oh, it's amazing. Okay, so once you've successfully broken Unity and it's a ghost of its former self, we click defaults. Well, we click the layouts menu, and we can get back to safety, familiarity. In my actual projects, I rarely use the actual default layout, but when I teach, I always try to like make my window look like your window. So using default's an easy way to do that. Okay, let's make a new game object. So we're going back to talking about the layout. We're going back to talking about the user interface. In Unity, there are 3 ways to make a game object, and all of them are to pick an option from a menu. We have 3 ways to open the same menu. The first is the game object menu up top. There it is. That's the menu I'm looking for. It's got a create empty, create child, and create cubes. Pardon me. So we could make an empty game object. I could call it, make cube. I could give it a mesh filter. Well, hold on. On the cube, we can look. It has 3 components by default. It has a mesh filter with a mesh cube. The mesh filter is a component that looks at a hard drive of a 3D model, and it turns it into something that other components can use. It doesn't really do much on its own. It is used by the mesh renderer. So if you have a mesh renderer, you need a mesh filter. And the mesh renderer looks at that and it displays it visually for the camera system, for the rendering system. It has a materials property that's probably the one we actually want to change whenever we change it. Otherwise we can, for now, ignore most of that stuff. And it has a box collider. This is part of the physics system in Unity. It has no visual representation in the game. You can see in my game, if I turn off the mesh renderer, my box goes away. Turn on and off the box collider, nothing's changing visually. What's changing is the physics system is looking at this, green cube and says, that's a solid place. Don't let things overlap that. Physics. So that's what the box collider does. And hey, look at that. You can also enable and disable them, keeps them in memory, keeps their settings there, but they don't actually execute their code. So we can make a mesh filter, give it one of Unity's default shapes, and we can make a mesh renderer. So we just click the add component button to add a component to the scene. Let me delete the scene in there. This looks hot pink. Delete the cube that's in there. This cube looks hot pink. It needs a material. I can click that little circle icon and to give it a material. But instead of giving it a material, I'm going to make my own. When I make my own assets, I'm going to make them via, I'm going to make a folder that I'm going to keep my assets in because I'm not a monster. So I'm going to make a new folder called materials. Go ahead and do that. Next, I'm going to, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I'm going to right click. I'm going to go to the create menu, or I'm going to click this plus button, which is the create menu, or I'm going to go to the assets window, which is the create menu, which is very similar to the game objects, where I can go to the game objects, which is the create game object menu, this plus button, which is the same create game object menu, or I can right click and get to the same game object create menu. So there's 3 ways to get to creating game objects: the right clicking, which is what I always do, the plus button or the menu up here. And there's 3 ways to create assets, actual files on our hard drive. Right clicking in the project window, going up to the assets create menu, or clicking the little plus button. Okay, and we're back, and we're forward. So we're gonna make an asset. I'm gonna right click in the asset in this new folder I made, Okay, so we're going to make a folder. Create a folder. And then in that folder, I'm going to call it materials with a capital M and a plural S. But I don't know. Everyone always names their stuff like that. And I'm going to create a material. My cube. I'm in a syncing folder. I'm in a synchronizing folder. And I crash Unity. I told you not to do it. I told you not to do it. Okay, pause. And I'm back. And I'm back. Okay. Lost my train of thought. Hey, I'm glad that happened. I'm glad that I crashed Unity just to demonstrate why it crashed, because it was in a synchronizing folder and all my computer was trying to like grab the files and make changes, and well, not change them, but like copy them, and Unity was trying to make changes, and they fought. There was a conflict. Oh well. So don't do that. Don't put them in your OneDrive. Don't put them in your Dropbox. Don't put them in your box.net. Don't put them in your Synology. Unless you know what you're doing like me, except it still breaks sometimes. So what were we doing? We were making a material. Yeah, we're making a cube from scratch. So we're making a material. We're going to call it some material. Materials are information that the mesh renderer uses to tell the rendering visual system how to make a mesh 3D shape appear. So a 3D shape is just points and lines and faces. And the rendering system is like, what color is it? What texture is it? How does light bounce off of it? How does light behave around it? And all of that is defined by a material. If you know what shaders are, a material is an instance of a shader, basically. Anyway, so we have a mesh filter. I can add let me delete the cube that's in the scene already and go to my cube. We can click the add component button to add a component in the inspector with the right game object selected. We can add a mesh renderer. The mesh renderer has a materials slot, and it needs a material. And now it appears. That pink color is a warning. It says, hey, no material on this object. I don't know what it should look like. Here's something noticeable, so you'll probably see the bug and fix it. I've made a game that had a unlit pink color scheme. It was like pink and teal. It was like kind of a 2D shooter. And I didn't have a bunch of materials on my objects, and I didn't notice. So that's a mesh renderer. Last, we need a box collider. There's two. There's a collider and there's a 2D collider. You choose the collider. Also, for what it's worth, I've never met a single Unity developer. I've never seen one use this menu. I've never seen a Unity developer use this menu. Every Unity developer I've ever met clicks add component and they just start typing. They just start typing the name of the component. So maybe maybe we're all correct. Maybe not. All right. It's because it puts all of your scripts in one folder and you have to do something to put it in other folders and categorize it. So it ends up getting annoying. Okay. So now I made a cube from scratch, but that was kind of a pain adding those game objects. I'm always going to forget that we need a mesh filter. Instead, when we make a game object from this menu, we are making a game object with a bunch of preset components and a couple preset properties. So that's nice. But there's nothing, fundamentally different about the cube and the sphere. They're both game objects. One is referencing the cube mesh. The other is referencing the sphere mesh. One is using a box collider, and the other is using a sphere collider. Okay. So we need to change the properties and move them around. We need to first select a game object in order to do that with. So I made a game object. I made a cube. To click on it, you can click on it in the hierarchy. Let's say you have a whole bunch of items in your hierarchy and you're trying to find the one you want. You got the little search bar. So nice. Name your game objects so that you can use the little search bar. Click the little X. Oh, so nice. So good. So good. Such a good feature that no one uses. You can also click on game objects in your scene if they have a mesh renderer. If they don't have a mesh renderer, you cannot click on them. The camera does not have a mesh renderer, but it does have an icon, and you can click on the icon, as does the light. We call that icon a gizmo. There's a little menu up here where you can enable them and disable them. and you can turn them on and off. In older versions of Unity, it is the word gizmos. But as a mesh renderer, so we can just click on it. Where's my sphere? Turn that back on. Cool. So when I select my game object, either in the scene by clicking on it or in the hierarchy by clicking on it, it will appear in the inspector. So that shows up. The easiest way to move it around is to type directly into the transform the settings. Did I say easiest? Sorry, no, I meant pain in the butt way to move an object around is to type. But I will mention one important detail, which is when you're editing numbers in Unity, you almost always can put your cursor right to the very left of the text box and then click and drag. Nice. And then your mouse will wrap off the edge of your screen and come back the other way. Nice. So, you move your objects to the origin to 0, 0, 0. Don't make your scene off in 8 million, 8 million, 8 million or whatever. Be reasonable. Okay. What I like to do also is I like to move objects to like about the right place. And then I like to go in and say, okay, well, let me snap that to my grid. Let me roughly line it up and then go bup, 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 and snap it to the grid. There's add-ons you can get. There's we'll do that in a button. You can also on the control key. Okay. So we can obviously edit these values by hand, but there are easier and better ways to do it. And those easier, better ways are these little 3D gizmos that appear that allow us to move our objects. We can move them in one dimension by clicking on these arrows. We can move them in 2 dimensions by clicking on these little boxes. We can't move them in 3 dimensions because your mouse is a 2-dimensional input device. It can only move in 2 dimensions, so we can only interpret movement along 2 axes, left and right, up and down. And it's difficult to move your mouse accurately, so most Unity developers I know move sort of in 1 dimension, and they line it up, and then they rotate their scene camera. Yes, we're going to cover that. Just stay with me. They rotate their scene camera and they move it along a different axis, and then they rotate their scene camera and they move it along a different axis. If you had the 4 split, you would be able to do that without having to rotate the camera. Okay. For what it's worth. That is the move tool, and that tool is visible when you have the move tool selected. Your other tools are in this menu. In previous versions of Unity, they're up over here. But as it turns out, you can only use them in the scene view. So it made sense if you didn't have the scene window open, like doing this didn't mean anything. Switching tools is meaningless. So Unity moved it into the scene view, which makes more sense. Now it's this other stuff's up there. They opened up an API so that other plugin developers could use the same in-scene view menu system. And now all of our plugins are going to go from having 8 million different custom-built UIs to having a pretty consistent UI, and that's super nice. So that was a change in 2021.1 or 0.2. So the move tool. Keyboard shortcut for the move tool. Take a guess. Did you guess M? You're wrong. It's W for move. The next tool is the rotate tool. Just like the move tool, it gives us the ability to click on these red, green, and blue icons, symbols, shapes, and rotate our objects around the X, Y, and Z axes. It also gives us the ability to rotate around any axis, because you can, using the point where you click, you can convert 2-dimensional movement as that point on the sphere moving around. Okay. I don't like doing that. I almost never rotate my game objects using this tool because my rotations are usually like snappy. Hold down the control key to snap as well while rotating. The next tool on the keyboard shortcut for rotate is an R. Wrong. It's E, W and E, duh. Next is scale. And scale, very similar to move. At this point, you can take a guess. You can move. Hey, these colors have kept appearing for a while. Red, green, and blue. Why is that? I'm glad you asked. XYZ, RGB. Ow. Oh. I'm back. XYZ, RGB. I hope you didn't hear that. I hope that wasn't the cracking of my joints was an uncomfortable sound. X is always red, Y is always green, Z is always blue. Hold on, I'm lost. XYZ, RGB, always going to be your the line up and match. And that's true in Blender, that's true in Maya, that's true in Cinema 4D, that's true in Unity, that's true in Unreal Engine. It's true. Everyone does that. XYZ, RGB, you get it. You get it now. So no matter which way am I facing, which way is up, which way is down, green is up, good to know, ready to rock. Okay, scale tool. The scale, you get it. 1, 1, 1, back. Okay, next, this tool looks pretty weird. Makes a lot more sense if you're editing. I might close my scene. Makes a lot more sense if you are editing 2D objects in 2D. But as we learned, even 2D objects are 3D things in Unity. Unity does not care. So that is a 2D friendly transform tool. Yeah, it'll use the face that your camera's like most facing. I don't know, it just kind of makes sense when you look at it, the axis around which. And that could be a nice, easy way to manipulate your objects as well, because if you're trying to scale them, they're scaling around their center point, usually. So that's an easy way to scale them around not their center point. Lastly is the all-in-one tool, and I hate it. This was introduced in like 2019 or maybe 2018, but I learned Unity before this tool exists, so I learned my keyboard shortcuts, and I never use it because I have a trackball mouse, which isn't very precise, and I want to click on this or this or that or this, and I always click the wrong thing, and my life is terrible and ruined, and everything is bad. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Okay. Lastly is a space for custom tools that we don't have any by default. So those keyboard shortcuts didn't make sense. No, it's not. Wait. Edit bounding volume. Custom tool. Oh yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. It showed the custom. It just brings it up as another. It doesn't show a menu and then a submenu to select custom tools anymore. It just shows you them in this list. That's a good thing. The edit bounding volume is now, it's just right there. That's great. I bet that goes away if I click away. Okay, hey look, I'm learning about the new Unity version. Before you had to click on an object and if it had a custom tool, it would show up. Okay. Now they just show up. One less button click. Don't worry about custom tools. The grabber is the tool I haven't covered. That's Q for the keyboard shortcut. That's really only useful if you're using a mouse, but it does segue me nicely. No, it doesn't. I'm talking keyboard shortcuts. It's almost going to segue me nicely. Shortcuts, Q, W, E, R, T, Y. Q, W, E, R, T, Y. Hey, don't memorize the keyboard shortcuts. Just look at your left hand. Look at the keyboard in front of you. They're just in a row up there. Now they are visually lined up Q, W, E, R, T, Y. Now that's vertical, so Q, W, E, R, T. It's not quite as easy to like look at. I wonder if I can change that. Let me put it. Yeah, there you go. You can right click it. I'll put it back. I'll make it look like yours. Q, W, E, R, T, Y. QWERTY. So you don't need to remember that W is move and rotate is not R, but scale is R. You just got to remember that those are those keys up there, and you just kind of you find the right one, icon that shows up as you click around. Okay. So that's moving game objects around. But what about moving my scene camera around? I've done this a number of times, and I've annoyed you by having not explained it yet. And I'm not sorry about that, because keyboard shortcuts are a lot to learn, and this is the kind of thing that will come with practice and time more than with like memorizing. But basically, you need a 3-button mouse. You need a left click, you need a right click, you need a middle click button in order to use Unity, because I'm holding down the middle click button is important. I once had a mouse that had a really like difficult to hold down middle click. Like it had a lot of like, it was like a really dense spring, heavy force spring. And I threw that mouse in the trash can and got a new mouse when I started doing 3D work that had an easier to click mouse. If I'm on a trackpad or on a laptop, I'm gonna crawl into a little hole and cry because I can't use it. That's what that grabber tool helps with. You don't need to hold down the right click or the middle click button. You can click Q, and then your right click and left click will be different, right? Left click does this, drag tool, left click moves. Okay. So to move around or to rotate our camera, we hold down the right click button. We keep the right mouse button held down, and with the button held down, we just rotate. We move the mouse and rotates the camera. To move the camera along 2 dimensions, left, right, up, and down, perpendicular to its line of sight, we hold down the middle mouse button and move the camera. To move the mouse along that 3rd axis, so I got up, down, left, right, to go in and out, I scroll with the scroll wheel. So the middle mouse moves my camera. The right mouse rotates my camera. If you don't have a middle mouse button, fear not. One, you can click Q, and now you can move in and out that with move left and right that way, and you can kind of get around without the scroll wheel. But 2, if you hold down the right mouse button, take a look at that little icon, little 4 squares like the T piece in Tetris. That little icon, that kind of looks like the W, A, S, and D keys on your keyboard, doesn't it? Q and D. W, if you hold down the right mouse button and keep the right mouse button held, you can now do fly navigation, and it's like Minecraft creative mode. WASD, Q and E to navigate. Just try it out. It's very video game like, and Unity is made to make video games. So there you go. You shouldn't even be looking at me. This video should be minimized. You should be listening to me as you try these things. Just fly around, practice. Practice, I swear to God. Don't just like complain that the software is hard to use. This stuff's gonna take time. It's gonna take time to learn. It's slightly different than Blender. Oh my gosh, switching back and forth like I do all the time. What a nightmare. But it's fine with practice. It kind of comes together. Do they finally move this menu to somewhere useful? Oh yes, yes, snapping. Gosh, everybody, if you're not using the 2021.2 and you're asking me questions about snapping, my new answer is use the new versions of Unity. Oh, beautiful. Okay. You hold down the control key to snap objects. Okay. If you don't have the middle mouse button, you can also hold down the Alt key on your keyboard. And holding down Alt and left clicking and dragging will like rotate you. And holding down Alt and right clicking and dragging will zoom you in and out. So you can definitely use Unity without a middle mouse button, but don't. It's so hard, in my opinion, to do that. Okay, time for your first project in Unity. You must make a house. Let's edit the color property of this material. Let's edit the smoothness property of this material. Let's make a cube. 3D object, cube, wall. What's an easy way to make a cube of the same size? Well, I could copy and paste the scale, or I could duplicate it. Control D. Control D, move it over there. Rotate it around the Y-axis. Bam, Control D. Control D. Now, I want to stress something. In Windows, Control D deletes things. In File Explorer, if you select an object and you hit Control D, it will delete it. In Windows, if you select a file, in Unity, if you select an object and hit Control D, it will duplicate it. I really want you to remember which one's which, because I sometimes forget. Yeah, we're gonna edit this material property of that wall. We can drag and drop the asset onto the slot. We can hit the little circle and grab the right thing, or I can drag materials right onto meshes, which is just a nice little shortcut because it's annoying to do that. Okay. Control D, move up, rotate. Yep. I made a house. It's perfect in every way. And that is your first project thing in Unity. Right now in Unity open, make game objects, move them around, make a material, assign the material to the game object, rotate, scale, transform, move your view camera, do all these things that you are going to be doing 100 times a day in Unity. We'll get into actually making an important thing, making stuff move and behave and what this play button does. We'll get to that in the future. That's enough for this video for now. Am I coming in at an hour and 1 minute? Oh, just slid right, just over. Sorry, I was gonna say just under. It's just over. My goal was to go over everything in about an hour. But that's it. I'm done. Good luck. There's so many resources on this website and elsewhere. And email me. You're watching this video, you're probably in my class. Just email me. I got you. All right. Bye.